It brought up those feelings of tone policing and throttling, kind of like diluting the message in the name of effective framing.
How do I get my message across without the mess that comes with adhering to status quos and resisting change?
I would love for another educator to read this and then say, this helped me do this in my class, and now my students are like this.
I said, I can see a lot of people here are eager to respond to this question. Would anyone like to? And like 50 hands went up.
It's such a good move. How are you framing your argument? How are you framing the points you want to make?
Welcome to Curious Scientists, a podcast of diverse perspectives on navigating and excelling in STEM careers. Today, we're sharing insights on framing or communicating your perspective in a way that's compelling. Our guest is Dr. Adri Corrales. They're a researcher and educator in chemistry who's working for Unite Oregon, a statewide racial and social justice nonprofit. Let's start with a story.
This is 2017. I just started grad school. Then I get ready for my very first talk as a grad student. Up until that point, the research that I had read was about predicting who would fail and who would succeed in chemistry courses. Say you're an educator and I have a class of 120 students and I can point to 3 and go, you and you and you will absolutely fail this class. What good does that do to predict that? Do I just tell them they're going to fail? Like, what do I as an educator do with that? I decided what I would like to see in the research is where along the course content are these students performing differently than their peers? Is it right away? Is it throughout the entire time? Is it at the end? Because if we can figure out where in the curriculum we're losing a lot of these students, then we can do something. So all of those prediction studies were using things like math SAT score, and a lot of them talk about students in the bottom quartile, so like the bottom 25th percentile. I took those students and figured out that stoichiometry was where they performed the most negatively, where the most of the inequity was coming from. And I was presenting that. I was like, it's stoichiometry, where we see a lot of this inequity. So let's do something about that. And that's how I kind of closed that talk. And the very first hand to go up was this professor who was sitting like 3 rows back, and his hand shoots up the moment I finish my talk. And I'm thinking like, yeah, this guy's excited. Let's change science education. This is going to be cool. And I nod at him to be like, yeah, ask your question. What's up? And he looks at me and sits back and goes, I just want to ask, when did we lose the power in our own classrooms to determine who will and will not succeed in science? At the time, I was really confused by the question because I was like, power? We're not even talking about power. We're talking about assessments in science, and I didn't even know about power dynamics and hadn't even started my journey with critical theory to know how ironic that question was. And so I looked at my advisor, and he was very calm and collected and was just like, go ahead and answer the question. You can do this. And I decided to just look at the rest of the audience because people looked pissed. And I was just kind of like, okay, it's not right for me to stand up here and argue with this person. Yeah. I just started here. I'm a year into my career. This is my very first talk. So I decided to give the stage to the crowd. I said, I can see a lot of people here are eager to respond to this question. Would anyone like to? And like 50 hands went up.
It's such a good move. Oh my gosh.
Thanks.
Such a good educator.
There was this woman in a red blazer who caught my eye, and I let her respond. She led what ended up being a 20-minute discussion going from people to people, basically telling that guy very subtly that his power trip is coming from a place of supremacy and meritocracy, and that he could take many seats. That was essentially what was being conveyed from a variety of perspectives in the room.
Yeah, no, that is, wow. I think it's like both frustrating because there are the people who see a new scholar and they go, I'm going to haze them. And then there are the people like this person in the red blazer who are like, you deserve to be here. You're on this stage. I am going to call you in here. I'm going to help you and I'm going to support you. And honestly, that's amazing to hear that story, because a lot of the time it's a lot more of the first person that you encounter, a whole
Especially in
lot of the other
2018.
group of people. Yeah, yeah. That's an amazing experience that you had that much support and like community, people standing with you and helping you when
And
this guy's
that's,
trying to derail what you were intending to present, you know?
for me, it felt like, okay, if this is a real problem that educators are feeling with responding to my work, then we should chase this down.
Mm-hmm.
But it got me thinking a lot about framing that story. The way that I framed that work was, I thought I was being very objective. I was saying, we're defining these students in a very specific way, and we're identifying this issue. And given that this measure looks at pre-college math, these students are struggling potentially with the math in this topic. And if we are assessing chemistry, what are we measuring here? If this is where the greatest inequity appears, it was more of a question about what is it that we're really assessing? That was the heart of the work. Now I tend to frame my research a lot more about, still the same idea of what are we really assessing here, but also what impact does that have?
When I was learning how to write academic articles for education research, framing was more about what's your theoretical framework, what's your conceptual framework.
Mm.
But I don't know that there was a whole lot of attention paid to how are you framing your argument? How are you framing the points you want to make? And I think I really struggled with that, because that was a piece of that hidden curriculum, and that piece that I really didn't know how to do. I don't think it was explicitly talked about, like outside of just like picking your theory. But what I've come to from experience is, what's your audience? What stance are you taking? What's your value system? And more recently, how accessible is the language? Those are the pieces I think about when framing your topic, your argument, whatever point you're trying to get across.
Help me outline what these spaces look like. What is the theoretical framework space versus framing space, and how do you as a researcher separate those spaces?
I feel like they're almost like a Venn diagram. They sort of inform each other but are not exactly the same thing. Like your value system and the stance that you're taking, I feel like your theoretical or conceptual framework kind of informs that. But then you're also thinking about your audience and who's reading it and that kind of intent, which may not necessarily come from the theoretical framework. And then the style of writing and different approaches, empathy approach, interconnected approach. It's informed, but it's not the same thing as your theoretical framework. Your theoretical framework doesn't come until after you've written an entire introduction and you're framing the argument and the points that you're going to make in the introduction, which I find really hard to do a lot of the time because I need some things from my theory to make it make sense. There's part of it that goes beyond just your theoretical framework, I think.
It's like these two lenses that are overlapping. I would say the framework is the primary lens that I choose to look through when I'm writing that research study. If I ground it in my own perspective, there's a lot of things that I can miss. Granted, when you choose a specific lens to look through, there's a lot of the picture that you might miss, but
Yeah.
at least you're able to align it over time with multiple studies, and you can all agree that you're studying the same thing. That gives you some progress.
So when I'm thinking of framing an argument, a couple of my more recent articles is I think I framed it more in the methods are interesting. And so when I was framing it, I wanted to highlight some interesting and different ways that I went about using these different research methods. That was kind of like my focus. It was more catered towards researchers who may be interested, and showing basically here's how I informed my methods. I have a more critical lens that informs my method, so it does change a little bit of how I see the data. It changes how I carried out these investigations. And so I frame that more towards researchers because it kind of felt like the things that I was doing, an educator doesn't want to read that. And I don't want to make an educator read that because it's not necessarily practical unless they're trying to do some eye tracking research, which is
Yeah.
entirely possible. But that one was much more for researchers. And then there's another subset of that work that was more towards educators, where I crafted example questions based on what I learned from the qualitative interviews. And that one was framed from a practitioner focused perspective. So I started to pick what piece of this is interesting and who's going to find it interesting. And then I went from there.
I came across a TEDx talk by Dr. Nathaniel Kendall Taylor, and they were presenting research about framing and messaging and how it elicits positive or negative support for policies and reform. They were showing this bar chart where when you frame the message in an empathetic sense, meaning these people are people too, and we should support and help them, there was negative support relative to the control. When it was surrounding ingenuity, we who are trying to advance this policy are innovative and we can solve any problem. There was more positive support. The most successful approach was to use interdependence, where we're all connected in some way. So if we don't reform this, this is how it's going to come back to influence us. Am I framing my work wrong? Am I not supposed to use empathy? How do I get my message across without the mess that comes with adhering to status quos and resisting change?
So, when I first started thinking about this question, I had a hard time thinking of what is effective framing? How do you even define that technically? Because there's what's effective to me, and then there's what I notice more broadly is effective. It goes with what you mentioned in the beginning about including empathy in our articles in the way that we write, because we're writing about human experience. And I've noticed the same thing where it seems like when I'm writing from a place of empathy, it's not received well, and editors or whoever's reading it tell me to change it or to frame it in a different way. So it was like I had a difficulty finding examples that I think personally are effective. And then it brought up those feelings of tone policing and throttling of the published content, kind of like diluting the message in the name of effective framing, and reaching a wider audience.
I'm thinking back to that example that got us talking about this, where they tested the message under empathy, interdependence, and ingenuity. And just looking at empathy and interdependence, I guess the empathy frame of that paper would have been our students deserve better than this. So we as educators should do our best, and here's one way that we can serve that community better. Is that empathy or is that interdependence?
Yeah, how do they define interdependence in this? Because when you first described it, it came off to me as interest convergence. Like, well, this is also going to serve me too, kind of thing, when I saw the interdependence. So it didn't seem like an interdependence in a community standpoint, but more of a what's in it for me standpoint.
I agree with you. Let's go on the assumption that we have it right, that it isn't so much about interdependence and community or reciprocity, it's more of what do I get? So if we were to frame the message of what do I get, then I guess we could have framed it as if you write your assessments this way, your class might be more equitable, which might look good to your department. You will be perceived by people as a better person and can brag about your saviorism and how you, I don't know,
You can
like
brag
how would you?
about, you can share your lower DFW rates compared to the other sections of the course. It's almost like, what's in it for the teacher besides more work? You'll get better class evaluations, maybe.
Yeah, from a minority. So I don't know if they'd, right? Because what if that comes at the cost of the majority of the class and they don't like these more equitable assessments? And
Mm.
Maybe these are some of the internal struggles that an educator goes through when they read something like our work. Like, what is in it for me? I'm busy, I'm doing my best, but I've heard of the perspective of people are gonna, there's always gonna be a population of students that fail my class.
Yeah.
And I do everything I can to give them resources so that they don't fail. But if they don't pursue them, that's their fault. And it just feels like that perspective is grounded in some stress, some
Yeah.
anxiety, some frustration with the general system at best. And at worst, it's genuinely harmful. So, yeah, it's tricky. How do you make an interdependence argument for improving science education?
Yeah.
That's part of why equity related STEM education research can be a difficult path to take, where majoritarian perspectives are used to review you, and the success of that work is judged by how often people cite it. It might not reach the audience that you want to begin with. And then on top of that, to tie why we should make more equitable STEM courses into an interest convergence, that just doesn't sound like something that a critically informed scholar would even want to do.
Exactly. When I was thinking about effective versus ineffective, we have these messages that are catering to those empowered, and those are deemed effective because they are getting through peer review or they're approved by the powers that be. I've noticed it's a lot of like, well, we want this to be equitable so we can have more people in science, stronger innovations, more workers, that kind of justification for things. But that's not how I think about it from my own personal values. So I almost wonder, how effective is it for me to come at it more from like, well, it's the right thing to do, these are people, versus it's going to help the workforce, it's going to forward production and things like that. Effective framing is hard because it depends on like your audience, and are we catering to the general public, to researchers, to educators, especially since we're publishing a lot of academic articles. It caters to other academics. We're actually not effectively framing for the people we might want to direct our work towards. I see effective framing outside of formal academic writing. Anytime I see like a cool infographic or something like that, that feels effective to me because it seems like more people will see it, things that aren't behind paywalls, stuff like that. And then less effective sort of framing to me feels like when we're over jargony, when we are not being accessible to the reader.
We wrote an equity paper together,
Yeah.
and we got reviews that were, well, to be fair, we got some good reviews, but there were instances where I felt like we were being tone policed, where they
Yeah.
wanted us to walk back the words of like racial marginalization. They wanted us to walk that phrasing back and just be like, it's just different. And it felt very like, if you want to be published here, you need to tone the justice talk down.
Yeah.
That puts equity researchers in a weird position because here we are encountering a power dynamic that is biased when we think about who is reviewing our work. And so, what does success look like for something like one of our papers?
So I think the general idea of success, and the thing that I've been told is success with things like this, is obviously how many times are you being cited? How many people know about this thing? How many people are retweeting your tweet about it? Those kinds of things. And how much engagement are you getting? But it's usually from the rest of the research community. And I'm sitting over here like, that's cool and all, but I would love for another educator to read this and then say, this helped me do this in my class, and now my students are like this. That's what I would like to see, and that's how I would measure my success, if I write something that is actually practical and helpful to another person, rather than just building up my repertoire of papers. So if we're going by just the regular measures of success, then it would be like clicks. Then yeah, you want to use the framing that the editors may tell you to do, or the framing that is generally accepted, but my values don't necessarily align with that. So of course my framing would be different. I'm thinking of a different audience.
Makes a lot of sense. We're science education researchers, and we're publishing in academic journals where the primary metric for success is how often it's cited by other researchers. So then, are we writing the paper for other researchers to cite? Or, and I think this is more the intention of our paper, we were writing that paper so that science educators would look at it and go, okay, here is some data that I can use to inform how I structure my chemistry course. That would be the goal. But then there's so many things about that medium of using academic journals that limits our impact in that space. Some of those things include paywalls. I mean, how long was our paper? If it took more than 5 minutes to read, I don't really know a whole lot of science educators that have the time and the energy to unpack all of the statistics and the other things. Ultimately, it feels like we're just talking in a little echo chamber when what we're writing and where we're writing and who we're impacting isn't aligned. It makes sense that framing becomes a really important idea. So my next question for you is, how would you reframe that message if you were trying to present it to researchers versus trying to present it to educators, regardless of the medium?
So, presenting it to researchers, I would want it to direct it to people who are curriculum developers and are using the research to actually create different interventions. The paper they wrote would be useful for someone to cite if they're writing a grant. We need evidence that we do need to change the way we assess. We need some money to use a research-informed approach to rewrite some assessments. So I would want to cater a paper to researchers who are doing that, because then I think we could actually reach the audiences we want. If we're talking directly to educators, I would frame it in a calling in sense, because I know for educators, it's really hard to change the things that we do in the classroom, pressure from other people. The amount of time you have to prep is not enough. And calling in of like, here are some things we could do that are actually accessible with the very limited amount of time we have to do those things.
People don't really care when you're like, hey, we published this paper, come check it out.
Yeah.
People are like, yeah, good for you. And your friends will be like, heck yeah, we're so proud of you. But general society doesn't care. And that's fair, because it's an accomplishment for me. So why would you care? I get that. And as I've been studying, how can I get a message to propagate beyond just my friends group and for it to be useful? A lot of people have pointed me to this idea that we all start in this sort of problem state where there's something we're trying to achieve and we're encountering obstacles, and there's this place on the other side of all that that we want to be. If you can frame your work or your communications in accordance with that, it's likely to resonate with more people. And so when I'm thinking of framing nowadays, just to reflect what you're talking about who the audience is and why you're writing it and how it connects with them, and thinking back to our initial discussion about empathy versus this like interdependence, this kind of selfish interdependence, I think that reflects it a lot, where it seems to be human nature to look for things that are helpful to us and what we need. And so if you were to frame an equity study, for example, instead of framing it with dire messaging, where if we don't do this, we are cruel people and we don't want these students to succeed. Framing it that way, I can see getting a really negative response, because these people who work so hard on their courses are getting that threatened and they're being called bad. And more than anything, as social animals, we don't want to be bad and we don't want to be left out until we have been called that too many times. And we decide, sure, I'll be bad. But really, I think a lot of us we don't want to be hated. We don't want to be ignored. We want to make a difference and we want things to be better. So dire messaging might not work, right? And then if we were able to take a little bit of empathy for the audience member for a moment and merge that with that kind of selfish interdependence of, what do you get? Well, if I'm framing this as the problem state is I'm an educator and I have the problem of I want my courses to be more equitable. I specifically am looking for resources to achieve that. And we frame our research of, okay, if that's what you want, this is what the data is suggesting, and this is how you can do it, 1, 2, 3. If we can frame our work that way, then we are achieving that goal. What do you think of that?
I think it kind of comes down to something that when I was writing about my knowledge surrounding framing is the fact that we have this traditional way that we frame academic research that's just inaccessible. And so when you're jumping into the social media world and seeing how do we actually get people to click stuff and look at stuff and actually read it, um, it looks nothing like anything that we've been told. And so it's just this
Right.
huge paradigm shift. This is probably a big reason why people are not looking at our stuff. And it totally makes sense. As soon as somebody makes an infographic, a magazine article, or an editorial, a video, a podcast, or anything else, I'm more interested in wanting to look at it than I can only read so many academic articles in a day before my brain turns off. Even when it's my special interest, I still, it's like, there's a level
Yeah.
that I kind of am like, all right, I need a break.
I
So
love
that makes
that. What immediately came to mind for me was this visual of like, say we put on half the screen the rules of academic writing, like impactful academic writing, the way that we were taught. And on this side, we think about impactful social media and just compared the two. Do you want to play a game with me? Have you seen those social media content where it's like, we're academics, we
yeah.
do blah, blah, blah? Do you want to play
Of
that game
course we
with
do
me and just go
this.
back and forth? Let's do
Okay,
it. I'm
yeah.
excited. Okay. We're academics. Of course, we expect you to spend 12 hours reading our research article and disentangling all the jargon. Huh?
We're academics. Of course we read your article. No, we didn't.
We're academics. We appreciate the feedback from reviewer too. Thank you.
We value your work life balance, but also we won't change your deadlines.
Sorry, that was so funny. Oh, academics and work-life balance. We're academics. We buried everything that was relevant to you in the supplemental.
Oh my god, that one hurts me because it's so true.
What
Oh.
are the rules for academic writing and how are they completely different from social media? Because our
Mm-hmm.
visuals are so sparing and it's almost encouraged to you to not have any visuals. If you write a paper that's just text and tables, reviewers seem to really love that. I don't get that.
Oh. Yeah, me neither. Because I feel like I end up adding more figures to get my point across. 'Cause having a figure that shows your conceptual framework is just going to do a whole lot more for my brain than a block of text explaining it.
That's what I think. Like, that's the thing with social
Yeah.
media is that visual is king, right? If you can make it visual, you're doing great. But in academia, it doesn't seem to be like that. And obviously, social media being concise and to the point and helpful is the
Mm-hmm.
goal.
Yeah, and then it seems like in framing, it's like you're still being verbose, and it a lot of the time dilutes your message anyway. Even though the manuscript is 20, 30 pages long, it still doesn't convey what you wanted to convey. I don't know. With the graphic design stuff, it really makes me think I get why there's not enough graphic design and that design of figures because we're already doing too many things at once, and having to learn how to make interesting graphics is a whole other skill. But it kind of just goes back to the fact that we as academics aren't very good at delegating, at sharing projects, and getting help when you know you're not the person that necessarily knows enough to do something. I always feel like I don't have enough help. I would love to have more help, but there's not enough connection between different researchers and people in different spheres that you can sort of have that community built project. It's usually one person's leading the project, you have maybe a couple people helping you, hopefully, but generally, like the first author's doing most of it. It just feels like with a lot of teams, there isn't a team. It's just one person with maybe a couple of helpers to help a little.
It does feel like it's too much to do sometimes.
Yeah.
And it throws into question, like, why do we do so much just to convey our work? Think of how productive we could be if conveying our work was a little bit less intense, if it was like the way that I wanted to present the conference paper, it's just being like, okay, if you are someone who's trying to make your course more equitable, here's some suggestions. And this is the data that if you implement this, you might see this in your class. Suggestion one, suggestion two, suggestion three, and then call it a day. If we could write our articles that way and still have well-referenced works and data, we're scientists, but we're also trying to impact a real human system.
Mm-hmm.
And doing that through a research article is hard to do.
I think a lot of it comes out, at least in our field, is trying to establish ChemEd as a legitimate science. And I hear that from a
Yeah.
lot of people who've been in the field for a long time. We had to work hard to establish ourselves, and I get that. I never want to discount that hard work, but I think it has put
Yeah.
us into a place as a field that we are now so in trying to be in with like the hard sciences kind of academic community. It's pushed us so far away from like our audience that we
I
could
agree.
actually be impactful to and work with and be in community with. So that's our, of course our framing doesn't match that anymore. We're so far away.
If the
Mm-hmm.
impact of our research is supposed to be serving practitioners, then I feel like we've missed the mark, trying so hard to get funding and be included in these STEM departments. How do we not necessarily destabilize our whole career program, but walk that back a little bit and go, okay, it's great that we want to write research articles and get funding. Obviously, that's
Yeah.
essential, and those two things are very hard to pull apart right now. But maybe we should be looking for other ways to frame our work, to get our work out there, to actually make it impactful. Because if we're writing these studies and getting lots of citations, we get lots of grant
Mm-hmm.
funding, cool. But where's the impact on science education specifically? How can we make sure that piece is still honored?
Yeah.
What do you want to learn about framing in science education to advance reform?
So I want to learn more about, and I think this was one of our big questions from the beginning, is how do we subvert the traditional norms in academic writing while navigating and trying to get through the peer review process? How much can we stay true to ourselves and have our work be read? How can we frame something using critical theories and sort of call people in, but also provide critique? Because I find that I've really struggled with that, both like in publishing, but also in just like talking to people. And maybe not like struggled with it, but even in using things like a compliment sandwich, like a good thing, a critique, a good thing, it still may not necessarily land. And I have gotten in some real big trouble for doing that, for trying to frame things in a way that I think is going to be well received and it still isn't. And so I don't know, just like how do we do that? And then how to learn more about framing and sharing ideas outside of standard academic channels and how that framing is different. So even what you talked about with how you're framing things for social media is going to be different. I want to learn those different things. Like how can we share our work and share information outside of what we were taught was the thing to do?
Mm, I love that.
Yeah.
I'd like to learn those things, and I'd like to know what challenges people encounter when an argument is being framed to them. You hear X topic or argument. What's going through your mind? What is the psychology of how closely you identify with that topic and how that makes you react to hear positive or negative things about it? Specifically, like how do you frame something so that you can inspire support for that reform, for that change, for that idea without having to water yourself down, without having to limit yourself in that way? Or is it even reasonable or rational to ask us to do that?
Mm-hmm.
How can we frame things in our research so that they're helpful to educators? Like, do we even need publishing?
Yeah,
Do we
it's a
need
good
to
question.
do we need to outgrow publishing? Is probably another way to think about it.
I love
All
that.
right.
Can that be the title of something?
Can we outgrow this?
How do we
Grow up now.
outgrow publishing?
Should we put empathy aside and specifically frame our research studies so that They emphasize what the reader has to gain from reading the work.
It's a question, to what extent do we want to work within the system, and to what extent do we want to do something else entirely?
Yeah, I agree. And this is something that everyone could appreciate in any career or life walk. There are times where your inherent values get called into question by what is accepted as the norm. You have to decide, to what extent will you play into that system, especially if you're the one trying to change it. How much am I going to play into this so that I can play the game? And how much of it am I going to play the game so that I can end the game and make a better one?
Yeah.
I don't have an answer there, but that's a cool thread.
It's a great thread with no answer from me right now.
No, if you have an
But,
answer to
yeah.
that question and you go, I know exactly how to answer this, please contact us.
We want to know.
Next time, we're discussing how to bridge the gap between research and practice. Subscribe so you don't miss it. If you're already subscribed, thank you. Please leave us a review or a comment so that other diverse scientists will be shown this resource. Keep it curious.